our next talker, Nortal's head of engineering, Priit, the host of Estonia's probably newest and best IT podcast, Algorithm. And Priit will be, as you already can tell, be talking about remote work learnings from internal project teams. All right, Priit, take it away.
Hi, from my side as well. So the topic is actually quite a mouthful, but the contents is hopefully much more approachable for many of our viewers and listeners. So before I dive in, let me share a few details about me. So why am I talking about this topic at all? I have been part of Nortal for over 13 years. And over that time, I worked in various projects in multiple different geographies, in very different team setups, and in very different conditions. So I have been part of writing code, creating architecture, helping to launch projects and consulting existing project teams. So during that time, I have had a chance to work with customers in US, worked with teams in Lithuania, Serbia, and Romania. I have had an opportunity to experience a 13 hours long video call with screen sharing to solve an issue in customers' environment. An issue that wasn't in no way our fault or wasn't our responsibility to solve, but there was something that needed to solve. So I helped to jump in and solve these things. And this kind of describes all the different environments that I've been in. And I have learned a few things from that experience. And today I want to share 4 topics with you that have stuck with me from these past experiences and past projects. So let's get going. So the first one I have been kind of thinking about is purposeful documentation. So what is a purpose of a documentation? And in many cases, documentation is written for some purpose, be it either an auditing purpose or just for the purpose of writing documentation or having documentation at hand if needed to present it for some legal issue. And in different projects and in different contexts, the same documentation may serve its purpose very differently. So let's take code examples or code comments at first. So the first example shows a really stupid comment. If I would see that in any of the code for any of the teams I'm working with, I would delete that immediately. But when we put the same code snippet in a context of learning, then this seemingly excessive comment actually becomes valuable. And on the other example, you will see some sort of formula without any explanation what those values do or what the formula outputs. It just says that it's calculating some sort of value. And if I'm working alone on this project and on this method, I probably don't need any documentation about this thing. If it's a proof of concept that I'm throwing away or some sort of initial prototype, then I probably can remember for that short period of time what that code is about. But when the context changes, when I get new people in my team, or I want to share the code base with others, then this kind of change of context suddenly highlights different kinds of issues with that same code, right? So how it can influence different kinds of documentation. So we have architectural documentation that has the purpose of describing big picture today, the role of different components and connections between them. Now, if we take a fairly good documentation about architecture, then what I've seen that it's often explained by an architect to another architect or a developer at a whiteboard. So they either use TV to show the big picture, or they use the picture for a reference, and the architect just draws out all of these components on a whiteboard and explains them as they go through it. Now, this works great when two people are in the same room, but when people are at a distance, and that distance may be either working from home offices or working in a different offices, or working in different time zones entirely, then the same documentation or same picture about architecture might not serve its purpose. So what happens, or what I've seen happening, is that the further the distance, the more details are actually needed about the architecture or about the picture, and not just details about what this component is actually doing on the model, but also details about why this component was added at the first place. So the past experience I've gathered this from is actually when I was working alongside with teams in Romania and Serbia, and there were teams in Estonia as well. And Estonia had most of the analysts, some of the architects, and fairly little development teams. And most of the development teams were actually located in Romania and Serbia. And when we had these kind of plain architecture diagrams or architecture documentation, then people on the other end didn't understand why those decisions were made. And since they didn't understand the reasoning behind it, they didn't kind of evaluate those decisions either. They kind of took it as they were, and they just assumed that if those decisions were made back in Estonia or somewhere else by somebody, then that was the right call at that time. So there was no critical review for those decisions. So what's happened there is we saw the actual need to add additional layer for the architecture documentation to include the information or the story behind all of different decisions. So if we included a component, then we didn't just describe what was the component about, but also why it was brought in at that specific point of time. Over the time, probably architecture decays a bit, and this sort of information helps to understand why certain components still exist in the architecture. It kind of gives the background, when were they introduced. So if you see a monolith component, you inherently immediately assume that, oh, it has to be an old component or old piece of code. But it may be a very calculated decision to build that component as a monolith. And that decision needs to be reflected in documentation as well. So the lesson I learned from this is that we judge design, and also design of entire solutions and design of code, that we don't understand. So if we put something together ourselves, we understand it thoroughly. And it can be a monolith or any kind of architecture, and we know the reasonings and kind of the we know the reasons why this picture looks like it does. And if somebody else looks at it and they don't understand what's being drawn out there, they're going to be judgmental about all of the different details. So moving on, next kind of documentation that needs to serve its purpose is describing all different kinds of changes, like I don't know, issues and issue tracker about what needs to be done, what change needs to be implemented. And these include mockups, as I said, Jira issues, and they may serve an audit log purpose, but they most definitely serve a purpose of transmitting knowledge from one body of knowledge to another, kind of sending the message from one point to another point. And that means that the content of this change may not be understandable for a reader who is not familiar with the context, because the change description often is based on earlier work and is linked to that. So it's not holistic in a way. And it usually contains as little detail as possible, assuming the reader has sufficient background knowledge for that. Now, if the distance is large between these teams who share information with this kind of change descriptions, then just as with the architectural documentation, this change description needs to be more and more specific. So when I was working for that US customer, the time difference between our USA team and our Estonian and Lithuanian teams was 10 hours. That meant if the technical product manager on the customer side described a need for us or the requirement that had to be groomed today by the team, then if that team didn't thoroughly understand the change, they didn't have a chance afterwards to go back to that TPM and ask for more information. So they had to go back in the evening and work on this the next day. So everything was delayed for 24 hours. And that's a big thing. So the change description needs to be, again, more detailed whenever the distance is large. But there's also always a drawback. So if we make the change descriptions more and more detailed, then usually what happens is the people who are receiving the change description start to think less and less about what they're actually doing. And there's a true real life story from the world of software analysis, where analysts put together a specification, a documentation about what needs to be done, and it was passed to a developer who hopefully reviewed it to some extent and started working on this. Afterwards, in production system, there was a bug discovered, and that bug already was present in the specification in a way that it wasn't specified how the system should behave under those conditions. And the conclusion that came out from that experience for the analyst was that she didn't do good enough job, and she needed to make the documentation even more detailed for the next time. And once she did that, and next time the documentation was even more detailed, it was passed to a developer, and developer saw the documentation and figured that, hey, it must have everything covered because it's so detailed, right? And the developer starts to think even less about what's really in it and thinking about the corner cases. So there's always this fine line to balance between becoming too detailed and being detailed, sufficiently detailed. Okay. So the next one I want to share is about specification as well. The story I already shared, so you don't need to go too detailed, but the level of detail is really important, especially for specification, since the specification needs to be kind of read like a well-written prose. So it needs to be, you need to be able to read it as a good book, for example. So and understand it. There needs to be this part of documentation or specification as well. So you might have, if you look at these diagrams about the chair, you immediately understand it's a chair. Now add a few stories about how this thing can be used and why all of these curves are really comfortable, and you get a full picture of why this thing needs to be like it's defined. Another idea about specification is that when the team sits in one place, then it's easy to understand. it's easier to understand if the specification meets its purpose. So if team is in one place, the developer often asks from analysts about the specification, some additional details and questions. And this is something that's not transferred well over chat or even over video calls. So it requires a lot of different, lot more communication over a lot more different channels to transmit the same message. If we're sitting in the same room with an analyst and I'm reading the documentation, they may perceive from my impression, from my face, that I'm not understanding some specific details. There's a lot more back and forth communication exchange in those situations. So another thought that probably developers are very familiar with is to review all and review often. Optimal code reviews are small, but in remote conditions and in these situations where teams are not sitting with each other, there are a few additional aspects that I think are important to be covered and observed. It's really important to ask for feedback in remote situations, since the work that's being done often may vary in size, and even partial code and partial documentation can be reviewed. So it's important for a developer to understand what's the optimum amount of doing reviews, and it's the responsibility for a developer to at first ask for feedback, and secondly, make sure that the work that's on their table is small enough to be reviewed independently. So work can be split in multiple ways, and some ways it's much more reviewable than in other ways. The rise of different architectural patterns, such as using microservices, has significantly increased the reviewability aspect of the code base, because it's already forcing us to start thinking in these kind of smaller pieces. But a lot about this is something that we can influence ourselves as well, to start using feature toggles to limit the functionality that we put into up to the production point, and that allows us to start implementing smaller and smaller pieces of the same feature and pushing that out even to the customer without needing to enable the impartial features in production. And asking for feedback is important for other reasons as well. So when I spoke about specification, I spoke about kind of sensing when other person doesn't understand the specification or doesn't understand the message fully or in the same way. I think the same goes for developers. So if somebody introduces a code, if there's a developers meeting in live environment, people are sitting in the same room, and somebody introduces a new feature or new design that they want to implement in the code base, then feeling the sentiment in a room is much easier than feeling the sentiment over any video channels. So it's really important in those situations to ask for the feedback and not wait for it to come kind of naturally. So using checklist is also a very familiar pattern in terms of code reviews, but it's far more important to do that if something changes. So if you look at the past documentation and you discover that the context has changed, so the team has grown twice the size, the team has distributed to multiple geographies, or people suddenly had to start working from home offices, then you need to do some changes in your process or some changes in your documentation so that this documentation also fulfills its purpose. And sometimes this sort of changes can be verified or ensured via review process. So we need to add some additional information to an architectural documentation, and reviewers can make sure that this additional information is added. But it's sometimes difficult to track all these changes, and using a simple checklist for architectural documentation reviews helps to keep all these aspects in mind. And just use the checklist for the changes. It doesn't have to be a 10 or 15 item checklist. You can just make sure that something that's in the focus today is important and that is fulfilled. Yes. So another thing about reviews is messaging. So if you're sending something out for a review, you're probably going to get some feedback. You're probably going to get some comments in the code or in the reviewing environment, be it either GitLab or GitHub or anything else. But it's also important to have an agreement on different other events. So what happens if I approve the code and I don't have any comments? Then it's only polite from me to add a comment about that. Add a general comment that the code is okay if I'm not merging that myself, or maybe if it's a partial review, so I don't have to merge it myself. The developer just wants some intermediate feedback. So giving back that feedback is really important, and that you probably understand. But it's also important to give back a different kind of ACK or acknowledge messaging. So all of the messaging or communication via messaging is asynchronous. And even if even video calls are partially asynchronous. So my calls or my words are reaching you with about 20-second delay. And if you are having a regular video call and you try to sing happy birthday for somebody all together, then you will see it's a mess because the voice, the latency for each different connection is slightly different, and that turns out to be an asynchronous blob of something similar to happy birthday song. And if you're thinking about the regular message-based communication, then that is even more asynchronous, right? And any event that we send out or receive, we cannot assume that it's being received. So if I send out a message in a messaging platform that even shows when the recipient has seen the message, doesn't mean that the recipient is actually working with the message at this time. So it doesn't mean that the recipient has the time at this point to start working with that message. So whenever the recipient sends me back an acknowledge message saying that, okay, I will work on this, or okay, I can work on this in an hour, then this gives me really good information about when I can assume the feedback to come back. Yes, so this is something that translates sometimes to cultural differences as well. So something I saw with our USA teams and US customers. So in some cases, there was an issue on some environment, and it was called out to a developers team to, hey guys, we have this sort of issue, nobody's seen it before, do you maybe know something about it? And what happened occasionally was that the kind of Nordic nature of Estonians and Lithuanians, this kind of Baltics nature maybe, started to solve the problem immediately. So they went in, started to investigate the problem and look for the solution, but they didn't give the immediate acknowledgement back to the customer. So half an hour or hour later, somebody asked again, hey, is anybody working on this? But the development team was already working on this for some time already. So they didn't give back the acknowledge. This frustrated people on the customer side. It happened a few times that multiple people were investigating the same problem. But we got over this by just defining a proper messaging etiquette in a way that if something like this comes in, the first response is acknowledgement that I'm working on this, or I'm assigning somebody on this to look into the root cause of the issue, so that all of the parties are aware of what's happening with the specific issue. Okay, so the next one I have about reviews is about praising and learning. Often there are multiple right answers for single problem, or multiple right or good solutions for a single problem. And when people are doing code reviews and they're located in the same room, then they share this kind of feedback much more easily. So they review the code, go for a coffee, and then they say that, hey, it was actually well done, I like the design. Or they review the code and over the desk, they just say that, hey, you have a typo in that method, just fix it, otherwise it was awesome, I like the code, it was all good. And this kind of feedback often doesn't translate to a remote environment. And it translates especially bad when people are working in different time zones and different time locations, because it's even more distant. Somebody sends me a review, I come to work in the morning, we'll have a stand-up call with that person. For me, it's early in the morning. For that person, it might be late in the evening. And there's no time to do these kind of code review exchanges right there and then. And afterwards, the other person, other developer already leaves, and I'm doing the review, giving back the feedback, but I'm kind of writing like to a black hole. So I'm writing something and it gets read sometime in the future, but I'm not getting the immediate feedback. I'm not getting any thanks for that immediately that I probably would get otherwise. So it's really important to keep that in mind and still have this these kind of social elements in the communication, even though it's really, really remote. Now, for the third thought from my side, it's really important to work for the deep work. Everybody needs their concentrated work time, and this doesn't come by itself. So you need to really work to have that time for deep work. And there is no silver bullet to do this. And I've seen over the different projects, I've seen very different solutions how people do this. So one option is to have a really strict scheduling calendar. In high pressure times, I have even set up out of office message indicating that, hey, I have a lot on my plate. So if there's any chance you can find anybody else who can maybe help you with that problem, please consider that option first. And it has really helped me out. And it might be useful even in current times where people are working in home offices. So defining an out of office message for a certain time in the day when you know that you need to work with your, do some schoolwork with your children or are obliged to do something else. So you're busy at that time to give out that information for others. Because usually in other conditions, in other situations, people see that you're in the office, so you might be available. And if you're not in the office, then they send you an email that's usually not critical. Another option is to use a do not disturb sign for yourself, and this can be very different. I've seen people closing off all their different distractions like chat applications, email, and one team actually, when working in the same room or in multiple rooms actually, they used Pringle cups, so the regular Pringle cups, and they glued a colored paper, a red colored paper on one end and green colored paper on the other end. And usually all of these cups were standing on everyone's tables with green end on top. And that meant that they were available for any kind of question or feedback, or any kind of, if somebody needed help, they could approach them. But if the red end was on top, then that was a kind of strict sign that I'm busy, I'm not working, I cannot help you right now. I'm in my kind of deep work zone. And the third option that I've used myself and found to be working best for myself is to use a hoodie and headphones. So I don't have a hoodie right now, but having having a hoodie and headphones in your ears is really a good sign for all of the different team members and even your family that you are busy, and this can be made a rule that nobody should disturb you at that time. For me, I learned that lesson when I was working with a customer. I needed to do kind of a pre-production workaround for some unknown conditions in the middle of night. So I needed to start writing code at 12 o'clock and be ready before the production release in 4 a.m. So it was really high pressure on one end. It was nighttime, so I was kind of low on energy, and there was a local manager who was really kind of pushy in these terms. He often came by and asked, "Hey Priit, how is it going? Are you getting this thing done? Do you need anything else?" So I needed to give him a polite sign that I'm working on this. Like, I need some time to get into my zone and get this thing out of there. And this kind of hoodie and headphones worked for me and has worked for me ever since. So the fourth kind of aspect of this kind of remote work, or fourth learning from that, is to work with yourself, and not just do some work with yourself, but rather have your today's self work with your tomorrow's self. So work together with yourself. And what I mean by that, let me expand that a bit. Setting yourself goals and realistic goals is really, really important. So setting goals for a day or a week is really helpful to keep things aligned and keep on track of getting things done. And it's really important when setting these kind of goals to set aside all judgment. So don't think about what is enough, what I should get done, but it's important to understand what can be achieved and completed. So it's the same way how we plan our sprints and groom sprints. So we don't think what should get done and let's take all of that in. We rather think about what the team can do and what's the sufficient and enough amount of work that the team can get done with a given set of time. So it's really important to make that distinction. And setting yourself goals and doing this kind of to-do list also helps with another kind of aspect, is understanding what are your actual distractions. And this is again something that we learned when with different kind of remote teams, was that one remote team from sprint to sprint wasn't able to meet their kind of sprint goals that were set for the sprint. And when people started digging more into why was that, we understood that there was a lot of requests from other development teams to that development team for technical support and debugging some sort of issues and understanding some failures in the kind of system as a whole, that actually wasn't their responsibility to get done. And only when they started to log all of these activities and all of these distractions, then it was possible to make some changes and get some additional time allocated for that team only for those activities, and have their kind of tasks that were planned for the sprint reduced to amount that were actually achievable. But that required all of this to be made transparent in a way so that it was understandable for all parties what the actual distraction was. Another way how you can work with yourself is to hand over work to self, to hand over for your tomorrow's self today's work. So it's really important in distant teams, be it either, especially important in teams that have big time zone difference. So when a team A in, let's say in USA, starts to triage an issue or possible issue in production or near production environment, they do a lot of they follow a checklist or playbook. They try to understand what's the root cause of the issue and what could be the possible solutions with kind of least amount of impact on the rest of the system, right? And once they do that, and what happens, for example, if it's already evening, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, they probably don't want to go on and work on this. Maybe it's a longer issue and requires some additional development to get fixed. Then what usually happens is that work is handed over to another team in another location that can continue and go on with the work. And that requires certain kind of documentation, again, exchange of some information about what was done to triage this issue, what I was working, what was working and what wasn't working, what's the root cause of this issue, and what can be done to try and solve this thing. Where did we look for the cause and where it wasn't, just to make sure that all of the teams are on the same page and they don't repeat the activities and waste some time. But in the same way, you can hand over work to yourself. Just taking 10 minutes in the evening to write out what was done today, what I was kind of working on right before I drew the line and stood up and said that it's enough for today, and what are the 3 next most important steps that I can do tomorrow and what I can start with tomorrow. And when you do that and next day you come at your computer, you have a big code comment saying that start here, this is where you left off. It really helps to gain back the context, to gain back the kind of the deep work time or get into the deep work zone again. So this is really important to do, in my opinion, at least. And the last idea for the last learning, working with yourself, is to have a personal retrospective. So once you do the handover, once you write out everything you have done today and where you can continue tomorrow, it's really easy to have a small retro with yourself, concentrating on your own personal actions. So concentrating not on my project manager gave me or asked too many questions today, so I wasn't able to get anything done, but rather concentrating on my own possibilities and opportunities. So I should have been more clear about my free time today so that I would have had less questions from the project manager. And in the beginning of the talk, I shared how I was in a 13-hour call with a customer. And that was, for example, one occasion when I afterwards did a small retro for myself, with myself, just to understand what I could have done differently to avoid such a situation, and what I can do in the future to maybe overcome these kind of situations more easily. So this is again another 10 to 15 minute practice that you don't need to do every day, but it's especially useful to understand when you are working in a different environment, when something changes, you're out of your regular routine, so you need to probably make changes to that routine constantly, and to do that you need some sort of reflection to understand if those changes are actually working. So that's all from my side. I'm open now for the questions.
Thank you, Priit. That was an amazing talk. I actually have a few questions, as there don't seem to be any from the live audience. I wanted to ask you about perhaps you talked a lot about different processes that you had. You know, whether it's an analog process of putting on headphones and sort of disabling distractions, along with retrospectives and everything like that. I wanted to ask if there are any tools that you might have tried or recommended, or that you would recommend.
The most efficient tool is pen and paper. I especially like the bullet journal approach to write down different distractions, different to-dos and tasks. And even Microsoft To Do now has these options, how you can separate your work based on today's goals and weekly goals and so forth to have this additional split. So these are the tools I use.
Cool. Another question I had was about language barriers. You talked about obviously Nortel having different offices and different people that work with us as partners and so forth. Have there been any cases where the sort of tasks and the sharing of knowledge has been blocked by a language barrier?
I think I can't remember any specific example, but this is definitely something that needs to be understood. Even on the project domain level, the vocabulary may be very different, and people need to understand the words the same way. So if we think of even the concept of getting things done, or saying that this is done, then it needs to be aligned for the entire team, be it in whatever location they are, what this done means. So is it just, or a different example is working on it. So if something comes to my way and I'm saying I'm working on it, does it mean that I'm looking into this for a few hours and then this issue is on its own, or I'm taking the full responsibility of getting this issue done or reassigning it to somebody else? So up until the point that this is completed. So in different cultures, it's understood differently. In some cases, when people say I'm working on it, I look into it, it just means that they look into it briefly and they don't follow through up to the completion point with that issue.